Okay, so as I mentioned, you have been muted to cut down on background noise, and if at any time, you accidentally become unmuted, just make sure to mute yourself once again. As you are sharing, communicating, and asking questions in the chat box, please be sure to send those comments to all participants. It's a drop-down menu within the chat box, so that I, our guest presenters, and your colleagues can see your questions and information shared. And just one more quick note about questions today. We will have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the session, so I will be collecting questions and comments as they come in. So please drop your questions into the chat box as they come to you, and I will relay them to our guest speakers at the end. The closed captioning link will be pasted in the chat box. We will also be recording the session today, and you'll be sent a copy of this recording once it's processed and uploaded to the NNLM YouTube page. This process typically takes about 2 weeks, but I do anticipate it maybe taking a little longer just because of our Thanksgiving holiday next week. So this webinar also grants 1 MLA CE. To claim the CE, please fill out the survey that will pop up in your browser after you exit the webinar. If for some reason you don't see that survey when you leave, I will also be posting it in the chat box near the end. Or if it just misses you for those 2 methods, just send me an email and I can send you the direct link. I will also include that link when I send out notification of the recording as well. So now that that's all out of the way, let me say welcome to everyone. I'm so glad you could all join us for today's installment of the Beyond the Sea webinar series as we welcome Erica Brody and Hillary Miller from Virginia Commonwealth University. And let me now introduce our guest speakers for today. Erica Brody is a research and education librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University, serving as the library's liaison to the School of Dentistry since 2017. She holds a master's in public health from Emory University, in addition to a master's in library science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her experience includes work in library and clinical settings, the CDC and EPA, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and RTI International. Hillary Miller is the Scholarly Communications Librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University. In this role, she supports and expands the university community's understanding of scholarly publishing, open access, open education, copyright, and research impact. She holds a master's in library science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So everyone, please welcome Erica and Hillary, and I am now going to hand over control to them.
Nice introduction. Am I echoing? I guess not. Okay, so I'm Erica Brody, and we welcome you to this program about evaluating information during COVID-19. So as you all know, we've been enduring the pandemic of COVID-19 since early this year. The pandemic continues because there is not yet a vaccine to prevent infection or a cure for those who become seriously ill. Scientific research to learn more about COVID-19 is being conducted by many people around the world at an unprecedented pace. Unprecedented in terms of how quickly research is happening. As a result, the pandemic has produced what the World Health Organization calls an infodemic, an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. This graphic shows the overwhelming volume of scientific literature being produced. This shows just those studies added to the database PubMed each week, about 2,000 articles a week for a total of over 70,000 PubMed entries about COVID-19 since January of this year. So we have all this new scientific information. However, epidemics are typically associated with rumors and misinformation. Think about SARS in 2003, HIV/AIDS in the late 80s and 90s, especially in the early stages of a pandemic when little is known about the health effects and spread of a virus. And with the internet and proliferation of web-connected devices, this intensifies and speeds up the spread of information, whether it is accurate or not. So during the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to discuss the quickly shifting landscape of information during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll start with a description of the types of information that are out there. While there is a lot of research being published in scientific journals, there are even larger volumes of other types of information. Then, to illustrate the rewards and pitfalls of different types and sources of information, we're going to review the progression of information about hydroxychloroquine, a drug proposed to treat and/or prevent COVID-19. We'll look at some of the consequences of the hydroxychloroquine information explosion and all of the debate that has followed. And we'll conclude with tips for navigating an infodemic. Treatment of COVID-19. So we'll start with the types of research communication that we're going to focus on today. So many of you are likely familiar with journal articles, descriptions of research methods and findings that have typically been peer-reviewed, that is, reviewed by experts in the field to ensure the validity and accuracy of a study. As some of you may have experienced, this process of manuscript submission, peer review, etc., can take a long time, usually several months to a year between the submission of the original manuscript and the formatted publication. That snail's pace doesn't work so well when information is needed quickly, like during the past spring when doctors just did not know what to do for the patients with COVID-19, and they had a lot of these patients. And with so many studies being done on COVID-19, the peer review system was hitting its capacity. As former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine noted, there's always a tension between getting it fast and getting it right. I always favored getting it right, but in the current pandemic, that balance may have shifted too far toward getting it fast. It's also interesting to see that the volume and type of information being generated about COVID-19 is actually quite different from the H1N1 pandemic that happened 11 years ago in 2009. In the first 3 months of H1N1, only 223 articles were published. During the first 3 months of COVID-19, there were 5 times as many articles published. Even more interesting, the type of research being published during the first 3 months of H1N1 was different than that for COVID. 80% of the H1N1 studies, that's 4 out of every 5, was primary research based on a unique study generating new information. In contrast, only half of the COVID-19 studies published during the first 3 months of the pandemic described findings from primary research. The rest were syntheses, summaries of primary research. So really a churning of existing information rather than new information. So syntheses of research can be great. In fact, we often think of them as some of the highest quality evidence we have. When they're done well, when they are true systematic reviews with several people involved in reviewing the literature, when a comprehensive search of multiple databases is conducted to get all the evidence available, and when the study quality is assessed methodologically, these also take a lot of time. But when you take shortcuts to save time, you're conducting a rapid review, where maybe only one person reviews the evidence, and maybe they search just one database, and maybe skip quality review. So with these shortcuts, you introduce the possibility of bias, and these rapid reviews provide lower quality evidence. Another topic related to published research that we don't always talk about a lot is retractions. While published research can seem like the absolute truth, there are times when the authors or journal editors of a study determine that the research was significantly flawed and should no longer be part of the scientific record, and the study is retracted. Actually, the study doesn't get removed from the scientific record, but it gets a big red warning mark on it, which readers should interpret as, this is wrong. As an example, 2 articles related to COVID-19 were published in prominent journals, The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, and later retracted by their authors because they both analyzed secondary data, and the data set they used couldn't be verified. You might have heard about this in the news. This was related to the Surgisphere data. So the next type of research communication that we're going to talk about is preprints. Preprints are research papers that haven't yet been formally peer-reviewed and published in a journal. Researchers sometimes share preprints alongside the submission of the paper to a journal as a way to disseminate their findings more quickly, which can be important during a pandemic when people are getting sick and some of them are dying. Preprints can also be used to disseminate negative results that may be more difficult to publish, which is also important in a pandemic when we need to know what doesn't work to prevent or treat a disease as much as we need to know which treatments are effective. Another benefit is the opportunity to get earlier and wider peer review. Authors may use the feedback they receive on their preprint to make revisions before or during journal peer review. And you might be wondering, are publishers okay with authors sharing papers online before they've been reviewed? And with having these preprints available online alongside the published version? Well, many publishers do accept submissions that have been shared as preprints, but this often comes with requirements, policies about which platforms authors can share on, or a requirement that authors add a link pointing to the final published version. So if you're thinking of sharing a preprint, you should always make sure to check the policies of any journals you're considering submitting the article to, just to make sure they accept preprints and confirm what requirements or restrictions they have for sharing. And there are around 70 platforms branding themselves as preprint services today across all kinds of disciplines. You can see a lot of similarity in their names because many are named after Archive, a preprint platform for physics, math, and computer science that was started 30 years ago. PubMed Central, a major research database from the National Institutes of Health, also began a pilot in June to add preprints specifically related to COVID-19, which means you will see them in PubMed. So preprints are becoming fairly common as a way to communicate research findings faster and gather feedback, and you're likely to come across them in your research. However, sharing preprints isn't without drawbacks and risks. As with all research articles, a single preprint isn't enough to form evidence-based decisions. It's only one piece of evidence, and one that hasn't yet been through the formal peer review process. This is especially important to keep in mind as evidence grows that preprints can drive public discourse as they are shared and discussed through news coverage and social media, especially during a global pandemic where everyone is seeking the latest information and looking for treatments and cures. It's always important for those reading research articles to assess study design and quality, the potential for bias, and study limitations. Because preprints haven't yet been through formal peer review, this kind of close assessment is especially important. Preprint platforms are also at risk of being taken advantage of by those who might deliberately share papers that have inaccurate, misleading, or false information, or those who just want to stir the pot. Some preprint platforms are taking new steps to mitigate these kinds of drawbacks. When the health sciences preprint platform medRxiv was founded in 2019, they recognized that there were higher stakes for posting non-peer-reviewed medical research than there might be for other kinds of research. So they put more stringent screening processes into place than other preprint platforms. medRxiv's screening process has even been described as peer review by another name. The screening process is mainly used to identify articles that might cause harm rather than to evaluate quality. So papers that contradict well-established knowledge, for example, a paper that claims smoking doesn't cause cancer, or papers that might fuel conspiracy theories may not be included. So our last two sources of research information move us away from the realm of research literature to mass media and social media. We have our traditional mass media sources, newspapers, magazines, television, radio. These offer interpretations of current events by journalists. And these media channels are competing for readers and their subscription dollars. So they take a complex research study and boil it down to a sexy headline like COVID-19 miracle cure. Many people won't read the actual article, and far fewer people will take the time to go to the original study published in a peer-reviewed journal, and even fewer may have the skills to critically assess the quality of the study. People reading the headlines might just run to their doctors demanding miracle treatments. In the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of new emerging sources of information. Our news now also comes from blogs, online-only publications, online presence of traditional media, and things like TED Talks and YouTube. Some of these emerging sources bleed into our next category of information, social media, which includes platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And by social media, we're referring to the platforms that can be used by anyone to share information. And because they're open to anyone, they're often used to share rumors, unsubstantiated information, and disinformation, which specifically refers to information that is meant to deceive. This means that information that is vetted and shared by experts or other reliable sources, including well-reviewed research, is competing for attention and trust in these spaces. To look at how these various methods of research communication have played out in the context of COVID-19 and the associated infodemic and how they've impacted decision-making, I'm going to turn this over to Hillary, who's going to talk about what has happened and is still happening with the drug hydroxychloroquine, along with its cousin drug, chloroquine.
Now we're going to walk through a timeline of some of the events around hydroxychloroquine and the debate surrounding its use as a treatment for COVID-19. And we're going to be asking questions like, why did it achieve so much public attention? Who proposed it as a treatment for COVID-19, and then who further promoted it? Why has there been so much debate, and what impacts has all of this had? First, I want to take a second to review the evidence-based or proven benefits of the drugs, hydroxychloroquine and its cousin drug, chloroquine. Both drugs are used to treat and prevent malaria, and hydroxychloroquine is also used to treat autoimmune conditions, including rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. In the first phase of the timeline that we're going through, the buzz around hydroxychloroquine begins to grow. In late January, online discussion began in China about the potential for hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine to treat COVID-19. And in February, the discussion expanded to Nigeria, France, and Vietnam. On February 4th, a letter was published in the high-profile, widely read journal Nature from researchers at 2 Chinese research institutions. The letter described study findings that indicated chloroquine might inhibit the replication of the virus that causes COVID-19. These findings were based specifically on an in vitro study, which means it was performed in a lab and not with human patients. And the researchers concluded that chloroquine should be assessed in human patients who have COVID-19, but they weren't yet advocating for widespread use in patients. On February 28th, Didier Rao posted a YouTube video about the benefits of chloroquine for treating COVID-19 based on the research in China. To understand why Rao and his claims about hydroxychloroquine got so much attention, it's important to understand who he is. So Rao is a microbiologist in France who founded and runs an institute dedicated to fighting infectious diseases around the world. And even before COVID-19, he was well known, partly due to his high rates of publishing and citation. So in other words, he was a sort of science celebrity who had a level of notoriety that made people pay attention to his claims. So on March 20th, the main event, as far as our story here is concerned, happened. Rao's study was shared through the preprint server medRxiv, and the article was published in the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents. It received a lot of immediate attention, especially because he had allowed it to be posted a few days earlier on Twitter by some others who were hyping hydroxychloroquine. But when researchers looked more closely, they raised a number of concerns, including a study design that non-randomly assigned patients to the treatment and control groups. as well as errors and discrepancies throughout the paper. The article reported on a very small trial that was scheduled to run for 2 weeks, but Rao thought the results were promising enough after just 6 days, so he decided to end the trial early and publish the results. Only 20 patients were included in the paper's final results, but others had participated in the trial, but had stopped treatment before it was ended, including a patient who developed nausea, patients who were transferred to intensive care, and a patient who died. In spite of these issues, within days, Rao's study was promoted by Dr. Oz on his Instagram account and on Fox News, and it was also promoted by the president on Twitter, all of which led to an even greater amount of attention from the public. This is when the conversation really started to get messy. There was constant debate about the benefits and risks of using hydroxychloroquine. More papers were published and then retracted, and policy decisions were influenced by this as of yet unproven research claim. One of these policy decisions occurred on March 28th, when the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine for patients hospitalized with COVID-19, which allowed the FDA to permit healthcare professionals to use the drug for off-label, not yet FDA-approved uses. And as a result, it also diverted the drug away from its normal uses and created the potential for shortages. Within about a week of the FDA's order, the president discussed the drugs at multiple news conferences, raising the public's hope of a promising treatment. And on April 3rd, taking us back to the original article, 2 weeks after it was published, we started to see formal concerns about the article when the International Society of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, or ISAC, who co-owns the journal along with the publisher Elsevier, issued a statement of concern about Rao's article, saying they believe the article does not meet the Society's expected standard, especially relating to the lack of better explanations of the inclusion criteria and the triage of patients to ensure patient safety. However, the journal didn't retract the article. A week later, ISAC and Elsevier issued a joint statement on the article, stating that they had commissioned a further review of it and that they had contacted the authors about addressing the concerns, but they still didn't retract it. Throughout May and June, more questionable and concerning preprints and articles related to COVID-19 were published and then retracted, including several related to hydroxychloroquine, which further fueled debate. The publishing blog Retraction Watch has a list of retracted and withdrawn COVID-19 papers if you want to see more examples. On June 15th, 2 months after it was issued, the FDA revoked its emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine for 2 reasons. First, as more research about the drug was performed, the case for its effectiveness as a treatment became less compelling. Second, because of the potential side effects of the drugs, and the FDA felt the benefits of its use didn't outweigh the risks. So getting back to the Rao article, on July 8th, the authors responded to Elsevier in a public statement. And the response is difficult to summarize, but the link is in the citations that are going to be shared with our presentation. And Erica is putting a link in the chat for you now if you want to take a closer look. A few days later, on July 13th, the journal commissioned review of the article was published in the journal. It was completed by Fritz Rosendahl, chair of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology at the Leiden University Medical Center in the Netherlands. And Rosendahl found that, as you see here, the paper, quote, suffers from major methodological shortcomings, which make it nearly, if not completely, uninformative. He also stated that it was fully irresponsible to recommend use of hydroxychloroquine on the basis of such questionable research, especially when people were desperate for treatments and there are potentially serious side effects from taking the drug. Rosendahl concluded, This is a non-informative manuscript with gross methodological shortcomings. The results do not justify the far-reaching conclusions about the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19, and in the view of this reviewer, do not justify any conclusion at all. With all of this, you might expect that the journal finally decided to retract the article at this time, but they didn't. On the same day the commissioned review was published, ISAC senior officers also published an editorial explaining why they chose not to retract the article in spite of the findings, saying that we believe, in addition to the importance of sharing observational data at the height of a pandemic, a robust public scientific debate about the paper's findings in an open and transparent fashion should be made available. The takeaway here is that even though an article has been peer-reviewed and published by a journal, it's always vital to do your own assessment and see how others are citing and responding to the research before making treatment decisions or any decisions based on its claims. So again, you might be thinking, after all this, we're getting closer to consensus about hydroxychloroquine, even if the consensus is something like more research is needed or benefits may not outweigh the risks for many patients. However, as the last step in our timeline, on July 28th, President Trump distributed videos touting the benefits of hydroxychloroquine in the fight against COVID. And this was over 1 month after the FDA retracted its emergency use authorization, stating that the effectiveness was not conclusive and that potential benefits for its use do not outweigh its known and potential risks. The videos shared included a video from a group calling themselves America's Frontline Doctors that was viewed millions of times and shared through Facebook groups dedicated to anti-vaccination and conspiracy theories. Doctors have reported patients who have demanded for prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine based on claims from social media. And this video and the massive viewing and sharing of it caused an uptick in these kinds of patient requests. And now I'm going to turn this back over to Erica to discuss the consequences of this hydroxychloroquine situation.
So this brings us to the consequences of the hydroxychloroquine case. So consumer demand for hydroxychloroquine is one example of the serious risks and consequences of social media and mass media hype about the drug. Risks that are increased when people in positions of power or authority post about such unproven therapies. As an example, patient demand for access to the drug followed hype about its effectiveness as a COVID-19 treatment and preventive measure, and doctors were using it in the spring since they didn't have other treatments to offer, even though the question of its effectiveness was still under debate. Further, when the president tweeted about unproven therapies, it led to increased airtime of this quote-unquote information and increased consumer purchases of drugs, including hydroxychloroquine. So this information, as well as policy decisions based on this information, led to shortages of the drug, and this made it harder for people with lupus to access it. And hydroxychloroquine is a drug that has been proven to help people with lupus. Hydroxychloroquine also caused some patients harm, including heart problems like arrhythmia. Some people confused hydroxychloroquine with other similar sounding but different drugs, including a man in Arizona who died after taking chloroquine phosphate, which is used to clean fish tanks. Another consequence of this hype about hydroxychloroquine relates to research priorities. On April 24th, there were over 100 trials of hydroxychloroquine going on, and many people were volunteering for these trials rather than trials for other drugs, which has derailed clinical trials of other treatments. And as of August, there's more than 250 trials of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 listed on clinicaltrials.gov. And 150 of these were listed as not yet or still recruiting patients. These risks have been exacerbated by sharing and publishing of questionable research, which has led to confusion about what the experts recommend and even who qualifies as an expert. And some people have spread disinformation, intentionally deceitful or misleading information about hydroxychloroquine based on research that's been called into question, discredited, or even retracted from journals. So with all of this quickly shifting information about hydroxychloroquine, we have a situation where we give people hope that this drug works, and then we have to say, oops, we were wrong. This creates a distrust of science, which could be very dangerous. For example, if and when a vaccine becomes available, people might not get it. And if too few people get the vaccine, this limits our ability to create the herd immunity that we need to stop the spread of this virus. One last troubling impact of this information landscape is that researchers have been threatened. In April, a researcher in Brazil whose clinical trial showed safety problems with high doses of chloroquine diphosphate received death threats for about 2 weeks until the study was published. These death threats came from people who believed in the safety of the drug. So this pandemic has really shown how the volume and speed of information from so many sources can cause a lot of confusion and some pretty negative consequences.
Come on. There you go. Come on.
In spite of all these negative consequences, there's also potential for positive outcomes. One example is how those involved in preprint platforms and journal publishing are responding. Changes to preprint platforms and peer review processes that aim to improve the quality and reliability of research that is shared or published will benefit us all, especially if these changes help us better balance the need for speed and the risks of moving too fast. You might remember us mentioning that an article on hydroxychloroquine was published in The Lancet and later retracted. As a result, Lancet is updating its peer review process. Some of these changes are about data used in research studies, including a requirement that more than one author of a paper has to be able to directly access and verify the data sets used. And further, if the group of authors represents a partnership of commercial and academic entities, at least one of the authors that accesses and verifies the data sets needs to be from the academic organization. Studies using large data sets will also need to be reviewed by at least one peer reviewer that has knowledge of that specific data set used in the study. And another change that will impact all articles is that peer reviewers will be asked about concerns regarding research integrity or publication ethics of manuscripts submitted for review. So some changes to peer review and publishing are already underway, and we're likely to see more as discussion in the research and publishing communities continues. Now, as an example of how these discussions are unfolding, we recommend taking a look at several articles in press from the journal Clinical Microbiology and Infection. In a forthcoming issue, the journal is publishing a systematic review and meta-analysis on the use of hydroxychloroquine with and without azithromycin for treating COVID-19, the same topic of the article by Didier Rao that we've been discussing throughout this session. Along with this, they're publishing 2 accompanying commentaries, 3 letters to the editor addressing the systematic review and the author's response. Finally, the editorial office of the journal is publishing explanation of the decisions that led to the inclusion of each of these works in the issue. The 2 commentaries in particular will be of interest. One was written by Didier Rao. The other was written by one of the journal's editors. They were meant to be a single co-authored commentary on systematic reviews, randomized controlled trials, and evidence-based medicine, but the 2 clinicians could not come to a common message. And now Hillary is going to close us out with some tips for navigating an infodemic.
Okay, so to wrap things up, we're going to share some suggestions, tools, and resources that librarians can use to navigate the infodemic and help their patrons do the same. Some of these are tools you can use and recommend immediately, and some are tools and trends to watch. So earlier in the session, we mentioned the publishing blog Retraction Watch, which is a great resource and which has been tracking COVID-19 related retractions. And now which is also partnered with Zotero to create a plugin that automatically checks your Zotero database and documents for retracted articles. It flags these retractions in the items list and provides some details and a link to more information. Another tool is Publons, a post-publication peer review platform. Some authors have shared that they value this platform and other platforms like it as an opportunity for recognition of peer review efforts. However, others have shared concerns that participation in Publons and similar platforms could be used to reward the quantity of reviews rather than the quality, since reviews on Publons aren't visible unless the journal uses an open peer review process. Publons also applies metrics to a researcher's publications and peer review activity. And as with any research and publishing related metrics, there are concerns about the limitations and the potential misuse of these metrics. So while there isn't yet consistent usage of Publons and other similar platforms across all disciplines or journals, this concept of post-publication peer review has been growing. So this is definitely a trend to watch. I'll also note that Publons and similar platforms have been used around COVID-19 to draw attention to or raise concerns about some of the publications and retractions that we have noted here. So you may also be interested to see how some of that conversation has unfolded on these platforms. One last trend we want to share is the use of artificial intelligence to track not just if articles are cited, but how they're cited. As an example, the platform Cite uses artificial intelligence to identify articles that either support or refute the findings of an article using machine learning algorithms. Cite now has a browser extension for Chrome, so you can see these Cite stats as you search for and read articles. And I haven't used this tool extensively, but I'm sure that you will recognize several of the names on the list of partners. So this is another trend and tool to watch. Based on everything we've discussed about the case of hydroxychloroquine, we have some tips for navigating an infodemic within a pandemic that you might find useful or that you might use as talking points with your patrons. And you might have others that you'd like to share during the time for questions and discussion, which we very much welcome everyone to do. First is never rely on one study, whether it's a preprint or a formally published article. One study by itself will never be enough to give a decisive or reliable answer. Also, when reading any research paper, always determine if and how it has been peer-reviewed. And if it hasn't been, give it additional scrutiny, as we discussed with preprints versus published, peer-reviewed published articles. Another is that a researcher's expertise should be specific to the study. Otherwise, you should read with a healthy dose of skepticism. In the context of COVID-19, not just any doctor or scientific researcher has the expertise needed to research and publish on something like the use of hydroxychloroquine to treat the virus. So you need to be wary of celebrity doctors. And another one that's very important to keep in mind and explain is, what do the authors say about the limitations of their study or research? And what are they actually concluding or recommending? For example, is it that hydroxychloroquine should be used in patients? Or is it that hydroxychloroquine should be further studied in patients, which are two very different findings and conclusions? Here's one example of some recommended reading you could share with patrons without scientific expertise, and there are many others. This one is How You Should Read Coronavirus Studies, or any science paper, published this summer by the New York Times. This is because the volume and speed of research coming out about COVID-19 is enough to overwhelm anyone, but especially anyone who doesn't have any or much experience with reading research papers. And with the widespread interest in COVID-19 related research, this is a good time to help increase everyone's ability to read these papers and in particular, again, to help them understand their limitations. This quote summarizes one of the most important reminders to all of us in this. Yet our current plight does not change the nature of the scientific paper. It's never a revelation of absolute truth. At best, it's a status report on our best understanding of nature's mysteries. So hopefully we have met some of these learning objectives and you feel more ready to do the following to help your patrons do the same. Navigating this quickly shifting landscape, describing some ways to approach the quality of information that's being produced, and identifying some of the limitations and cautions of relying on a single source of information for decisions. And going back to our original poll and single question, what do you think of hydroxychloroquine? So again, we do have these 4 options, and if the text is the same, it's correct. Number 3 should be, I think, first is hydroxychloroquine is not an effective treatment, is A. B, hydroxychloroquine might be effective, but more research is needed. C, hydroxychloroquine has been proven as an effective treatment, or no idea.
So if you haven't answered yet, you have about 20 seconds at this point. And I did go ahead and fix the typo in this second poll. So sorry about that, everyone.
Okay, and it looks like the results are in. And we have shifted somewhat. So before, I think we had about 3 in 4 or close to it who were on, I think it might be effective, but more research is needed. And we have shifted to closer to 50% actually that who don't think that hydroxychloroquine is an effective treatment for COVID-19. Some of that may have been due to the confusing wording possibly before, but I think probably what we're seeing is people leaning a little more towards some doubt in the effectiveness, with the understanding, obviously, what counts as effective may be a little bit more complicated in your minds as it became in mine as we were doing the research to prepare for this presentation, weighing those risks and benefits. So now we have some time for questions and discussion.
So I did see one question that is in the chat box now, and I can read that off to the both of you. In your experience as experts in this field, do you anticipate there will exist growing war over stalling credible content where media, popular or celebrity physicians, and attorneys will argue their constitutional rights to promote information, and it will therefore be up to the consumer to choose what they believe to be true about research?
That is a fascinating and complex question, but I think it's one of the points you've drawn out that's interesting are the limitations around expectations of how responsible people are with sharing information. So you could, have popular or celebrity physicians who have a medical license that could be called into question or removed or something, but they may be, at the level where they're not actually practicing as clinicians or anything. So they don't necessarily need that license or credentialing to begin with, which is certainly concerning. And for all of the other professions here you've mentioned, there is not potentially not as straightforward of a way to, to restrict people or punish, for lack of a better word right now, if they are sharing misinformation. So I do think you're right that besides, restrictions around platforms and platforms controlling what is shared, we may not, have as strong of a way, to vet and control some of this information. We didn't dive as much into some of the social media and mass media things here as well, but I think we could have easily done a whole presentation on those, and again, some of the debates and discussions and changes in some cases happening around like social media platforms as an example, and some situations where Twitter in one instance, Google in another, where a Google Doc was shared with some very concerning information, actually did step in and make decisions to remove the content from their websites. But you probably also saw that you kind of get to a point where the cat's out of the bag a little bit, and even as the scientific community starts to call things into concern, even if papers are retracted, the information continues to be shared. So, let's see. Erica, did you want to add anything there? And I know we have some other questions rolling in here.
I think just related perhaps to some of the other questions too is just that there is going to be a lot of information out there, so encouraging people not to take everything as truth right away, and that they really want to investigate. And I guess one question I see is, where would you place preprints and rapid reviews on the hierarchy of evidence? I mean, the rapid reviews I might even put in the same lower level with narrative reviews, just because they don't necessarily have all the same protections against bias. And preprints, I think some of it, preprints would depend on what kind of study it is and what kind of quality you think you can evaluate. I think the preprints scare me a little because they haven't been peer-reviewed and they're out there. And I could see, the benefit of having broader peer review happening in an open way, but having that information out there without being even peer-reviewed, I find a little troubling. And then, there was I think somebody asked what happens when you have patrons who find information on social media that's incorrect or misleading. I think that's a perfect teaching moment to suggest other more credible resources. I think, Medline Plus is like the first place I like to suggest people go for medical related consumer information, but even like the CDC or NIH websites are very helpful. So I went through a couple questions.
I'll add a couple of things in addition to, I also share Erica's concerns about preprints, specifically because we have seen them become very prominent in discussion happening online. I also think that this has shown, some concerns with the peer review process, where, I think there was a journal editor who, said something as we were researching that, the purpose of peer review has not necessarily been to catch people who are guilty of research misconduct. So I think a lot of the push happening around making research more transparent and more reproducible is really important. Alongside, it's not just about sharing things earlier, it's about making sure that more people have a chance to go back and check over the work and verify. Things like all of the Lancet is doing around data sharing is really critical because, we hope that peer review will catch all of these instances, not even of purposeful, deceit, or it could just be errors in some cases. I think that becomes really important. But what you talked about, that moment when people find the misinformation or incorrect information, it is really difficult because on the one hand, my instinct is to point to more reliable information that may counter that. But what I'm trying to do, the more critical thing is talking about these underlying principles of why, even if I share back a reliable scientific study that may counter that, it is still not enough. And I think the more difficult but longer term overarching goal is to actually have people better understand these principles about the limitations of any one piece of research or one scientist's perspective, and to understand how, I don't know, maybe what a systematic review is, as an example. If you were to share that with them and tell them why this is good evidence, might that make them more willing to listen to you or its results than any just the latest study that came out. Let's see, more questions.
I did get a question that someone sent directly to me, and it was, do you include preprints in the search results you send to patrons? And if so, do you include any disclaimer?
Yes, if I was it would depend on the patron. I mean, if it's a doctor or a healthcare provider that's looking for, what information is available, I am likely to send them, but I'm going to put a big note about which things are preprints, and I'm going to have a big definition of what preprints are at the top, really emphasizing preprints haven't been peer-reviewed. If it was a consumer looking for information, I probably wouldn't include the preprints.
Wow, there are a lot of really amazing questions coming in that I know we don't have time to dive into all of them.
The WHO literature database, I would feel pretty good about recommending people look at that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, again, the thing to, note there or try to explain or help people understand is how do you look at the bigger picture, right? I think the example of the article on how to read a research article is really great, but still with those limitations, we need people sort of looking at the bigger picture. I think also the person who said, the people think they're being lied to, that this is being withheld, the potential, the distrust in science. I don't quite know. It seems to both help and hurt. Something like the forthcoming issue of that journal we mentioned, where they are publishing the systematic review and all of the supplementary content that is putting out there and showing how this debate is unfolding, showing how there is disagreement in the community around how, as I think Didier Rao's perspective was, he doesn't really like systematic reviews as much. He doesn't trust some of these things unless he has sort of done the research himself. And again, I don't know if that is more helpful than hurtful, more hurtful than helpful, but I think in some ways you may be able to get a better conversation going if you can acknowledge that there is disagreement and debate in the scientific community, and that in the same way it's not helpful for us to always say, scientists say that this is not a good treatment, to acknowledge that debate so that there can also not be this monolithic scientists are lying to us and telling us that this is not correct.
Right. I mean, I think the key is emphasizing that science is a process, and the information we have is based on the evidence we have to date. I mean, I think what's hard is that that's kind of nuanced, right, and that doesn't play well in headlines as far as this potentially broad distrust in science. I hope we get to move forward from that soon. And then just one last thing. So the preprints about COVID are actually showing up in PubMed through PubMed Central because NIH is running a pilot project of putting preprints in PubMed Central. So you're going to see them in PubMed, but they're only doing the pilot for information about COVID-19. So you won't see preprints about other things.
Yeah, and you will see that those are labeled as well as preprints. And I believe the goal is to link those as well to the published versions when they come out. So you may start seeing those links show up as well.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Hillary and Erica, and thank you to everybody for being so engaging in the chat. I am posting now our webinar evaluation. If you would, we always want feedback and to hear what you have to say about these sessions. And if you're interested in the MLA-CE, that at the very bottom, it will walk you through that process. If you hit the radio button for MLA-CE, yes. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Erica and Hillary, for your time and insight and very detailed and researched timeline. That was fascinating. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Oh, and when the slides are posted, could you also please include a transcript of the chat? Yes, I can copy the chat, and I will just take everyone's name off of it, just, to de-identify everyone.